In a time marked by transformations, Absalom, son of David, was born in the kingdoms of Israel. David was known as a man after God's own heart. His arrival in the world was in Hebron, a city marked by ancient stones and stories of conquests. Absalom was the fruit of David's union with Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, a marriage that brought with it more than a political alliance. It was also a reminder that the paths of God and men are sometimes intertwined by mysterious threads. Since he was little, Absalom had a shine that made him stand out. It wasn't just physical beauty, although that was undeniable. His presence was magnetic, something that seemed to attract eyes and plant expectations in people's hearts. They said that there was no one in Israel as beautiful as him, and with each passing year, his figure became more imposing, his hair more notable, like a cloak of glory that he carried effortlessly. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. In David's court, the young prince grew up between luxury and responsibility. Living with his brothers, children of other wives of the king, shaped his personality amid veiled rivalries and silent disputes for attention and recognition. Even with all the wealth that surrounded him, there was something about him that seemed restless, like a river that found no rest on its banks. The relationship with his father David was like a fire that warms but also burns. Between them there was admiration, but also distances that could not be ignored. While the king bore the marks of battles and difficult decisions, Absalom seemed to live in the shadow of these achievements, yearning for something that perhaps even he could not name. Time passed, and the boy from Hebron became a young man who could not go unnoticed. Absalom grew like a leafy tree, strong and full of life, capable of inspiring admiration and, who knows, even a hint of envy. His beauty was commented on in every corner of Israel, and many said that God had taken great care in creating him. There was not a single blemish on his body or flaw in his appearance. From head to toe, he looked perfect. But it was her hair that caught the most attention. Long, thick, with a shine that seemed to reflect the gold of the sun, her hair would become, for better or for worse, an inseparable part of her story. There was more to Absalom than mere appearance. He had a presence that made others pay attention, a charisma that made him impossible to ignore. His words, although spoken in a casual tone, had the weight of someone who knew how to captivate and persuade. At the city gates, people watched him curiously, wondering if this young man, so full of potential, would one day carry the same weight that his father had borne. Absalom had a peculiar way of dealing with things. When he spoke, his eyes shone with a mixture of determination and challenge, as if he already knew that life had something great in store for him. At the same time, there was a restlessness in him, as if the blood that ran through his veins was always on the boil. Behind her beauty and her composure hid a restless spirit, someone who seemed to always be looking for something, even if he didn't yet know exactly what. But the life of a prince is not just made up of parties and applause. Fate, in its silent cruelty, seemed to be preparing a test for Absalom, an event that would change his life and that of his family forever. The days in Jerusalem continued their course, but the king's palace, so imposing, harbored secrets and pain that not even its high walls could contain. It was in this environment of apparent harmony that the tragedy set in, like a storm that arrives without warning. Tamar, Absalom's sister, was known for her grace and gentleness. His eyes, full of innocence, reflected a rare purity, something Absalom always swore to protect. She was more than her sister. It was a piece of his own soul. But Tamar's peace was brutally ripped away. Amnon, their half-brother and David's firstborn, moved by a vile desire, committed terrible violence against her. The act was like a blade that pierced the heart of the entire family. But it was Absalom who felt the blow most deeply. When he found out what had happened, he didn't scream, he didn't cry. He just welcomed Tamar into his arms, like someone trying to pick up the pieces of something that will never be the same again. However, inside him, a silent storm was brewing. David, the king, the father, remained silent, unable to act. Perhaps due to the weight of his own guilt or the complexity of the relationships in his home, he did not make a decision. And this silence was like fire fueling Absalom's fury. For days, he didn't say a word about what had happened, but his mind worked incessantly. His eyes, once full of brightness, now carried a shadow that few noticed. While Tamar retired, protected by him, Absalom waited. 2 whole years passed as if they were an eternity, but within him, each day was a brick in the construction of his revenge. The love for his sister had turned into a cold determination, a desire to bring justice into his own hands. And so, in silence, Absalom began to plan. The time to act was close. He knew that a blood debt is never forgotten. The 2 years of waiting seemed like an eternity, but Absalom knew that time, when used wisely, could be a weapon as powerful as a sword. He watched Amnon, the one who had destroyed Tamar's innocence, living his life as if nothing had happened. Each day that passed without justice was like an ember that burned deeper in Absalom's heart. However, he did not show his anger. On the contrary, he smiled, greeted, pretended that the past was just a distant shadow. But in silence, he plotted. It was on a seemingly ordinary day that Absalom decided the moment had arrived. He planned a grand banquet, something fit for a prince. He invited all the king's sons, including Amnon, to celebrate together. The invitation was made with such kindness and cordiality that no one could suspect his intentions. Even David hesitated, but Absalom insisted, "It will be a gathering of brothers, my father. Do not withhold your blessing." With these words, the king gave his permission. The party was prepared with care, every detail carefully thought out to make the night seem perfect. The wine flowed like a river, laughter filled the air, and Absalom seemed like the most generous host they had ever seen. But behind the smile, his eyes were watchful, like a hawk watching its prey. He had given clear orders to his servants. "When Amnon is drunk and vulnerable, you will act. Do not be afraid, for it is I who will take full responsibility." And so, it happened. At the height of the celebration, when Amnon was off guard, Absalom's servants killed him. The room, which until then had echoed with laughter and toasts, fell into a heavy silence. The smell of wine mixed with that of blood, and terror gripped the guests. The room was still shrouded in chaos. The screams of the king's sons echoed like ghosts in the great hall, while Amnon's body lay inert. The guests, stunned by fear, fled in all directions, like birds frightened by unexpected thunder. Absalom, however, did not move. He remained there for a moment that seemed infinite, as if that moment was his and no one else's. Revenge was accomplished, but the price of that choice was yet to come. Without delay, Absalom fled to Geshur, the kingdom of his maternal grandfather. He knew that David's court would never welcome him so soon, not after shedding a brother's blood. In Geshur he found a refuge. The land of Talmai was peaceful, with vast landscapes and clear skies, but for Absalom there was no rest. The weight of his actions followed him like a shadow, and although he had brought justice to Tamar, his mind was restless. What had he achieved, and what had I lost in the process? The years of exile began to pass slowly, like sand flowing through an hourglass. 3 long years passed, and during that time, Absalom's name almost disappeared from Jerusalem. But in David's heart, the memory of his rebellious son never ceased to exist. The king suffered in silence, torn between the pain of losing Amnon and missing Absalom. Despite the gravity of what had happened, David could not erase the love he felt for him. Perhaps it was this mixture of love and guilt that made him incapable of making a definitive decision. Meanwhile, in Geshur, Absalom began planning his return. He knew he didn't belong there, far from Jerusalem and the throne that could one day be his. His eyes, once bright with youth, now carried a mature determination, as if every moment in exile had shaped his outlook. But returning would not be simple. Absalom would need more than just David's permission. He would need a strategy, and he had one. Absalom's return to Jerusalem was a mixture of triumph and tension. After long years in Geshur, it was Joab, David's faithful general, who interceded for him. Joab saw something in Absalom that perhaps the king himself tried to ignore. An heir who, despite his mistakes, still carried the potential to lead. Convinced by Joab's persistence and the longing that burned in his heart, David allowed Absalom to return, but with one clear condition: he would not see his father's face. And so, Absalom returned to the city he had never forgotten. Jerusalem, with its imposing walls and the scent of its markets, looked exactly as he remembered, but something had changed. The distance between him and David was greater than any physical space. For 2 whole years, he lived in the same city as the king, but as a stranger, excluded from royal society. For Absalom, his father's silence was a heavier punishment than exile in Geshur. He was back, but not completely. It was as if he was trapped between 2 worlds. During this time, Absalom did not sit idly by. He began to build something that could not be ignored: his image among the people. Whenever someone had a complaint or sought justice in the king's court, Absalom was there, with an easy smile and words that sounded like promises. He presented himself as a friend of the people, someone who understood their pain and was willing to listen to what David seemed to ignore. Every gesture, every word was calculated, but his sincerity seemed so real that many began to prefer him to the king himself. Little by little, he was winning hearts, like a fire that slowly spreads through a dry forest. Absalom knew he needed to do more than simply win back David's love. He needed to achieve something much bigger. Absalom was patient, but also cunning. As the days passed, and he remained far from his father's throne and heart, he continued to work behind the scenes, as if weaving an invisible net, thread by thread. It wasn't just his beauty that attracted the people. His posture, his way of listening, his care in appearing fair, everything about him created the image of a leader who understood Israel's pains. He stood at the city gates, the place where people brought their disputes, and offered what seemed like a friendly shoulder. "Ah, if I were a judge on earth," he said with a sigh, "then everyone who has a problem or a cause could come to me, and I would give them justice." His words were like honey, sweet and comforting. He greeted people with warm gestures, embraced the humble, and made promises that little by little planted a dangerous idea in their hearts. Perhaps Absalom was the king Israel needed. The movement grew in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. What seemed like just a nice prince became a magnet for malcontents. Men from all tribes began to gather around Absalom, drawn to his magnetic personality and his ability to give voice to problems that David seemed to ignore. He stole the hearts of the people, not with violence, but with a smile and engaging words. When he finally felt the time was right, Absalom took the next step in his strategy. He asked the king for permission to go to Hebron under the pretext of fulfilling a vow he had made to God. David, perhaps believing this request to be a gesture of devotion, consented. But Hebron would not just be a place of worship. For Absalom, it was the perfect scenario to begin what he really planned, declaring himself king. As he departed, a new era was about to begin, and the winds of revolt were already blowing. Hebron, the city where Absalom was born, would now be the stage for his greatest declaration. He arrived accompanied by loyal followers, men who did not fully know the extent of his plans but trusted him blindly. In the silence of the night, orders began to be whispered. Messengers sent to all the tribes of Israel with a single message: Absalom reigns in Hebron. The news traveled quickly, like fire through dry straw, and before long Absalom's name was pronounced with reverence and fear in every corner of the kingdom. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, David began to realize that something bigger was happening. The king, with years of experience in battle and intrigue, learned from the arrival of a messenger that Absalom's movement was not just a youthful rebellion, it was a serious threat. The betrayal from his own son fell on him like a sharp blow. The man who had faced Goliath and unified a kingdom now found himself trapped, betrayed by his own blood. With no time to hesitate, David made a painful but necessary decision. He gathered his servants and those still loyal to him and fled Jerusalem. There was no room for confrontation within the holy city. When leaving the palace, David had a mixture of sadness and determination in his eyes. His sandals raised dust on the way as the people watched him pass, many with tears in their eyes, not knowing exactly who to pray to, for the king who was leaving or for the son who was rising up against him. As he crossed the Kidron Valley, the sound of his group's footsteps echoed like a lament. Some were bringing the Ark of the Covenant, but David, in a gesture of humility and faith, ordered it to remain in Jerusalem. "If it is the Lord's will, he will bring me back," he said, his words firm but his heart broken. In the desert, he knew the future of the kingdom would be decided, but he could not predict that the coming battles would involve more than swords and soldiers. The duel between father and son would be marked by destiny. The sun had barely risen when the two armies prepared for confrontation. On one side, David's men, tired but experienced, led by generals who had already faced formidable enemies. On the other, Absalom's army, vast in number but young, inflamed by promises and dreams of change. The place chosen for the clash was the dense forest of Ephraim, a place that seemed to breathe mystery, with trees that whispered in the wind and shadows that danced with the filtered light. The silence that preceded the confrontation was almost unbearable. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first sound of swords that would mark the beginning of the battle. When the war cry finally broke the air, everything exploded into chaos. The tree branches became silent spectators of the clash of men and weapons. The sound of metal, the shouts of command, the pleas for mercy, everything blended into a symphony of destruction. Absalom, riding a mule, crossed the battlefield with the grandeur of someone who believed in his own destiny. But the forest seemed to conspire against him. As he rode beneath the tall trees, his hair, that which had so often been admired, became his undoing. A thick branch caught him, trapping him as if nature itself had decided to stop him. The mule moved on, leaving him hanging, vulnerable, like a ripe fruit waiting to be picked. David's men spotted him, and word soon reached Joab, the general who carried loyalty to the king like a burden and a weapon. Ignoring David's orders to spare the young prince, Joab approached. Their spears glowed for an instant before piercing Absalom's body. Each blow seemed to mark the end of a story that had begun with promise and beauty, but ended in blood. As the woods returned to silence, the sound of horses retreating echoed through the trees. The war was not over yet, but the price paid at that moment would be felt by everyone like a scar that never disappears. The news reached David like thunder. The messenger hesitated, his face marked by a mixture of fear and regret. He knew his words carried the weight of something irreversible. "May the Lord bless the king with victory," said the man, trying to soften the blow. But David, anxious, interrupted. "What about young Absalom? Are you safe?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any direct answer. When he finally heard the words he feared, David staggered as if he had been struck in the chest. The great king, the one who defeated giants and led armies, now seemed fragile. He went up to the rooms above the city gate and cried, the deepest and bitterest cry of his life, "Absalom, my son Absalom, I wish I had died in your place." The words ripped through the silence of the night, echoing throughout Jerusalem like a lament that could not be contained. There was no one war that could fill the void left by the loss of his son. While the army returned, victorious, the atmosphere was one of confusion. The king's pain eclipsed any celebration, and the people didn't know whether to celebrate or mourn. David's heart, divided between justice and love, reflected the complexity of what everyone felt. Absalom had fallen, but the mark he left, of courage, ambition, and tragedy, would remain like an open wound that time would not soon heal. The days following Absalom's death were marked by heavy silence in Israel. David's lament still seemed to hang over the valleys and mountains, as if even the earth shared his pain. That young man who, in another time, had been the promise of a bright future, was now remembered as a symbol of excessive ambition and choices that led him to ruin. But his story, tragic as it was, had a lot to teach. Absalom was a man of great potential. His beauty, charisma, and determination were gifts that could have made him one of Israel's greatest leaders. But these same gifts became his trap. He allowed pride and the desire for revenge to grow within him like weeds, choking out the good in his heart. In his quest for justice for Tamar, he lost the ability to see the impact of his choices, allowing himself to be consumed by anger and a thirst for power. David, in turn, also bore his share of responsibility. His silence in the face of Tamar's tragedy and his difficulty in dealing with conflicts within his own home created the basis for Absalom's revolt. He loved his children deeply, but his love was often incapable of correction or discipline. David's grief was not only for the loss of Absalom, but also for his failure to save him from himself. The story of Absalom is a powerful reminder of how blessings can turn into burdens when used wrong. It teaches us about the dangers of pride, the destructive force of revenge, and the consequences of ignoring problems that need to be solved. But it also tells us about the love of a father, who even in the face of betrayal, never ceased to exist. Ultimately, we are invited to look at our own lives and ask, what seeds are we planting in our hearts? And will we have the wisdom to prevent the winds of ambition from dragging us away from who we really are? If you liked Absalom's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.